But this ties into what we were just talking about the Faustian spirit. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It's not Faustian. I'm
I
gonna say
think so. I'm
Faustian.
pretty sure it's Faustian. I think it's Faustian.
Yeah, I was reading the book "Decline of the West" by Oswald Spengler, which is a if you're in these sort of circles, it's a foundational work, and a lot of people hear the word Faustian spirit. I've talked to people. I've been in communities where people are like, what does that mean? Or you see people use it, and they're using it wrong, or it's kind of very very loose. And once you start reading, and this is the value I think of reading these books, you start to see where a lot of modern thinkers and speakers get their ideas from. Not to say they steal them, but this is kind of where it starts. Like you read this and you read Julius Evola, and you're like, okay, I see where this is, and it grows from there over the decades, because this book was written in, I believe it was 1915, 18 or something like that. I think we were looking that up before, right?
Yeah, 18 to 22, I think.
Yeah. So it's very, so when he talks about this stuff, realize that this is pre World War II. So once you realize that, a lot of what he talks about in the book is very prescient. And it's a long book. It's very dense with information and knowledge, and what his take on history. So obviously, I'm not going to get into all of it, but there's a few points that I had noticed are very interesting, that I like, and I'll just kind of explain them and maybe get your take on them. So the concept of the book is, he's got two main motivations for writing this. The purpose of the book is to look at basically the entirety of human history across certain key civilizations and find patterns. And he makes a point that for most of history, what he's trying to do is take what he calls a Copernican view of history, where people tend to see Europe as the center of the world, which is easy to do because his central argument is that each civilization is so distinct that usually when they speak of mankind, they're just talking about themselves. And you see this across India, China, Russia, other places. And he gets into that later in the book, but he's like, the reason Europe is the center of the world is because they're the ones who traversed the world and drew all the fucking maps, which makes sense. But he's like, a lot of historians of his time were like, he's like, let's take the broader scope. Like, let's see how each of these ancient civilizations actually matter. So, because it's very easy to see your own history as the history of the entire world, and as to a fault, because you think that your motivations and the soul behind what you do, and your advances were just kind of happening at the same time for everyone because we're all the same, and it's not the same at all. And I'll get into some of that a bit later, but he calls it, world as history, which is kind of a problem. The entire world as this one united history, it's not like that at all.
Yeah.
History is not just cause and effect, and each aspect of the culture is a symbol of a different sort of interconnectedness in the spirit. And we talked about this before. Like, when I would bring it up, when people talk about race, I would say, well, what is race? It's just your skin color. It's not. Your race is the interconnection of biology and history and culture and all and economics and values and politics and everything, and into this one sort of into a people, because race just means a people. He's kind of making that sort of argument, but more nuanced, and probably better than I did in the past. But every, like, Chinese people do economics traditionally different than Western people, and then different than Indian people. So it's all economics, but they're executed differently. Their markets work differently because they are a different type of people. So it's like everything they do is a symbol of this sort of central differentiation there, as a culture and as a people. So yeah, that's how it starts. So it's interesting. So he when he talks about the Faustian spirit, so he compares that against the classical man. He kind of draws a distinction, like there's the classical man, the ancient man, then there's the Faustian Western man. And the classical man, you might talk about the Greeks. They're like the last of the classical men. So he talks about, like, they don't really have a concept of history. They very much live in the moment, and this is reflected in their art and in their architecture. Everything's very flat. Even their plays are almost just these snapshot tableaus of moments in time. They don't really have as much of an understanding of dynamic character. So when you talk about the classical man, it's very, and their gods, it's very of the moment. There's no real past, there's no real future. It's just the present. And then the Faustian man, who comes after that, who evolves from that, it's this idea of, the I have a place, there's a future, we can compare ourselves now to the past, and we can project in the future, and there's this more of a will to power and a more of a dynamic understanding of the world around you. So, like, the classical man has no true sense of history, but rather sees it as an impression and creates a pure presence. So, because history has no practical value, there's no use of it. Who cares? And this is where a lot of mythology comes from. It's like they invent this sort of approximation of the past, but that's as much purpose as it served. And so he has this sort of idea here. The West exists under an optical illusion, and our morale is conformity to this sort of Faustian spirit. The idea of direction, claims to power, and will to effect a distant, general, and permanent validity. So the Faustian spirit, and again, this is why I think it has value, because this is what people criticize Europeans and the West of. Listen to, like, this is a known thing that, like, why do you guys always have to, why did you travel across the ocean and put your face in other people's business? Why do you have to go into America? Why do you have to build these things? Why do you, and you'll hear it now, like, black people and Arabs and Indians, it's incomprehensible to them why a white man would want to go into space. Like, why do you want to go into space? What's up there? What's up there? There? It doesn't, and they'll think it's a joke. They'll criticize it as a joke, but I look back at them and say, yeah, you don't get it. It doesn't even compute with you, the idea of strike. And that's why they don't go camping. They make fun of white people for camping. Why do you want to go in the fucking woods for? Why do you want to fucking climb a mountain? What's up there? It's like, you don't get it. And as once you start realizing that, it's like, it's not the fault of me for being frivolous. It's the fault that you, something in your culture, your DNA, whatever you want to call it, you cannot conceptualize the value of striking out into the unknown. And that explains your civilization and your culture and you know? And so the idea of a moral imperative, the idea of, and people are like, oh, Europeans are too strict or too regimented. And they're always trying to, and there's a dark side to this, the idea of projecting a moral imperative onto yourself and others. Now, the dark side of that could be imperialism. And in fact, I'll get into this a bit later, but the idea of, and this is also socialism. The dark side of that is modern socialism, where you're trying to create a universal ethic that everyone must abide by. Now, that's a twisted, almost Evolian, inverted shadow version of what it could be. And it's taken the place of all stuff. But the idea of a moral imperative and striking out and being, the idea of a main character taking on the universe is a Faustian idea. And traditionally, and he goes there, this book is full of references and quotes and points to different cultures and different thinkers, but even, and he talks about China a lot too. Traditionally, like, even Chinese stories and dramas, they grapple with the idea of, like, the character taking on the world. Now, even if you read, like, what's that? The Epic of Gilgamesh. I don't know how accurate that is. Like, he talks about a lot of stuff. Even the Epic of Gilgamesh is kind of the main character going out in the world. But and if you read Carl Jung, he's got some interesting ideas on the mythology and stuff like that. So I don't know how accurate that is, but it's kind of this idea. Anyway, and so I'm just reading a bit here. And so basically, he also says, each civilization is unique and each sees itself as mankind, like I said before. And I find this important because in our modern age, we're doing the opposite. And he makes a point, again, back in like 1918 or whatever, the thinker, the skeptic wants to find the value of all, or is the value of none. You know what I mean? And that's kind of the dark side of the Faustian spirit. Like, we're trying to find, the very thing that might have made us unique is also leading us down this path to a global cosmopolis, You know, the idea we're almost like very much a Marxian sort of thing. Like the idea of Marx is if you create this system with just the right ideas and just the right order, you will find the perfect system and value. And the idea of in science, the grand unifying theory of everything, like there's something in us that wants to like find the final ultimate perfect thing, you know, and that'll be it. But and he'll get into this later, that can actually lead you down a lot of blind paths. It could also lead to your own destruction.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about mathematics, and you know, he talks about history, math, art, science, religion throughout the entire book. He touches on everything, kind of like what Hobbes did with Leviathan. You know, it's trying to take on everything. So some stuff I like, some stuff you might not need. And there's some parts I skimmed when he was talking about like scientific stuff, you know, but ultimately it's good. But he talks about mathematics early on, and I was like, let's see what this is. He makes a few interesting points. Let's see here. When he talks about the development of mathematics, and this is the central point he's trying to get at, there is no actual world history. And if you look at modern historians, we talked about this before, about how historians don't like the great man view of history. They like the great movement view of history. That history is not written by these powerful leaders and idols. It's written by just these things that just kind of happen. So his point is, this is what mathematicians like to do, because we all know mathematics, as we know, developed over time over different cultures. It started with the Greeks, and it went to the Arabs did some stuff, and then the Europeans did some stuff, and the Chinese people did some stuff, and it kind of evolved over time. And if you ask a mathematician or even a historian, what they would say is, well, this is just the history of mathematics, right? It really has nothing to do in their mind with who discovered it and why and for what reason. It's just, it was just there to be discovered, and they happen to do it, and these people happen to do it, and it's just because they're smart. But
no.
That, you know, in mathematics is a great idea, because within mathematics you also have kind of a philosophy when you talk about imaginary numbers, and you talk about negative integers, and you talk about, to a classical type of mind, there's certain ideas that A, they could not understand, but B, might have understood it, but decided not to, because it would actually be hazardous to their culture and civilization. Like there's certain discoveries that they found, they actually found this, 500 years before, but then they kind of hid it because it was actually damaging. So the idea is that certain mathematical concepts could only have been discovered at that time by those people. It's not just like, it was a race to discover it. It actually had to do with the spirit and the soul of the culture that did it. So it was only the Arabs who could have come up with this sort of algebra stuff, and it was only the Chinese. And so instead of them just being, mathematics is this rail that we're all just discovering as we go, it's pieced together from the manifestations of these culture, and it probably couldn't have been discovered any other way, even with mathematics and even with science. It's not, and so there's this idea that science is just science history. No, science is actually cultural history too, and the history of peoples and civilizations. And if you view everything like that, it makes a lot more sense, because they don't have an answer for why Arabs did this at this time. It's just, I guess it's luck or something. And there's one other thing that I really like. We talk about symbols. He talks about prime symbols. So there, beneath all the symbols, beneath all of the stuff, there's something fundamental driving each of these great cultures. And he picks a few. He picks, the West. He picks India, China, and the Middle East. He calls them the Magian cultures, and he puts Christianity as under Middle Eastern culture, and I'll tell you why. But there's a core symbol around it. It's like the star which everything orbits around in one way or the other. So and it's kind of like an idea. So for the classical civilization, like the pre-Faustian man, it would be, it was the near and present bodily form of things, right? It's whatever was in front of you and making sense of it, right? And trying to make, and that with the Faustian civilization, our civilization, the core prime symbol is the concept of an infinite space. And when you think about that, like what is it at its core that might separate us from other civilizations? what do we do differently than them? It's infinite space, the idea of exploring space, exploring the unknown. And he says it manifests also in architectures. So, for example, in Greece, you would have these buildings, and what separated them, they're all often very similar, but what separated them was the frescoes and the facades on the outside and the paintings and saying what was inside. But with the Faustian, you started seeing the actual architecture start to radically change to fit what it was designed for. And this is where you started to see cathedrals reaching up, projecting into the sky, things like that, right? And so is this going further into nature, and he juxtaposes it against the Chinese spirit. The Chinese prime symbol was nature guiding the wanderer. And if you go back to basically the concept of the Tao. So the Tao, he said that's sort of foundational in the same way, Confucius might be, but the Tao,
yes,
story is that nature guides the wanderer through to his final destination, and that is reflected in a lot of Chinese and even Japanese architecture. You see their architecture, yes. It's a lot of gardens, it's a lot of incorporating gardens and open things where nature can come in. So you look at that, it's like, okay, like this core symbol you see, but everything orbits around that and manifests that core centrally. And you don't see that same thing in the West. You don't see that same thing in what you might call Arabia at the time. And so, he would argue that our prime symbol, and that is, we're seeing that, with Elon Musk, we're seeing that with space travel, but we're also seeing that is what other spaces can we conquer? And we keep trying to kind of go out, and then we kind of go inward and collapse. And again, that's where you get the sort of like modern communism and socialism come from this concept, for better or worse, and so does libertarianism. That's the same sort of spirit, striking out on your own. It's the same kind of thing, but it's a different style, and I'm going to try and and he talks about the Magian spirit, the soul, the Middle Eastern soul. And he talks about that as sort of the world as a cavern, a cave, right? And this is why he says all the Abrahamic religions come under there as well, because if you think about it, they're also similar because they see like the world as a cave, and then the light is coming in. It's a battle between light and darkness. So every Abrahamic religion, and this was not evident in Western religions or pagan religions, the eternal battle between light and darkness, and it's above them, and they're just witnessing that, right? So, and that's why you see, even though the Abraham, and here's an interesting point he made, as Christianity spreads from this sort of Magian Middle Eastern, we are just below the dueling between light and darkness above us. As it goes into Europe, it takes on a distinctly European flavor. And this is where you get the Catholic Church. Because you see Christianity, people, again, they criticize Western Christianity, but this is why they criticize. Like, well, you guys don't behave like the Christians are supposed to. You don't love people like Jesus. Like, yeah, because they're trying to map on Christianity to a centrally Faustian Western spirit. And that's why you get, the Crusades. That's why you're not just turning the other cheek. You're a Faustian sect. You're going to build a bunch of big fucking shit, and you're going to have these awesome like Roman rituals, and you're going to fight, and you're going to go out, and you're going to conquer. Now that you could argue that is not very Christian, and I might agree with you. And in there you find the truth of what he's saying. It's because they're trying to map on this other thing onto a pre-existing thing. And he even mentions within like the Catholic Church, you start seeing these old European symbols come to the front. That is basically what the Roman Catholic Church is. A lot of those symbols are Roman, right? And that's kind of the criticism validates the thing, is what I'm saying, and that's what I kind of find interesting. And it makes me think, like, he would argue that we're still in that prime symbol. This is the decline of the West because we're losing that. I would say, start thinking of prime symbols. Like, start thinking of, like, what is the central driving force? Are we modifying into something else at this point? Are we just going to die? Or like the between the classical man and the Faustian man, are we transforming into something else? That's something to think about. He quotes Nietzsche at the end. And at the end, one thing, I want to end on two things because I got to kind of get going. He talks about the stages. So the spring and summertime of a people is the culture. They're kind of risen out of the darkness, and they have a language, they have an ethic, and this is the blossoming of all the best art, and it's where you're developing your spirit. And he says that once a culture becomes a civilization, it ossifies. It becomes this rigid sort of thing. and it loses its starts to slowly lose its soul, and this is where people start to decline. And it's very evident in the Western world right now. And he said one of the things you start to do as your civilization solidifies, it starts to romanticize its own past because it can tell it's losing something, and so it starts to romanticize. And we see that right now. We even romanticize like fucking 60 years ago. Right, but we're always looking back. We're trying to get back to some. We feel that there's some kind of truth or purity in the past because there was, and we've lost that. And he also says, the last stage, and again, the dark shadow version of this Faustian spirit of every civilization is imperialism. You'd say, you can have wars, but wars usually have a reason. But he said there is a point you cross where imperialism just spreading out for the sake of spreading out. And he said he likens this to the Roman empires. That by the end of the Roman Empire, there was that imperialist phase where they're just trying to take land to sustain itself. There's no real goal. There's no real soul. It's just war for the sake of war. And as it's you forget why you're having wars. And the wars become kind of private wars. They become the purview of these people at the top. And he also talks about, again, on this downturn, you see Caesarism. And Caesarism is basically, traditionally the leaders, the kings, the monarchs, whoever is leading the fucking country, they were just representatives of the central culture and the central ethic and morality and the soul at that prime symbol. But as that soul dies, you start electing people just to have power. So they're not actually representative of this larger idea. And that is Trump. Trump is a representative really of himself. Trump is, we're giving him the levers and the buttons to pull because we want some crazy shit to happen. If your civilization is at the point where you're just electing a powerful guy anywhere, Joe Biden, same thing, fucking Obama, same thing, just to pull the levers and do all kinds of crazy shit, you have no soul to your civilization. And all you are is this imperialist machine that's just gobbling things up and hoping that you elect some kind of strong personality to revitalize. But it is impossible for an individual to revitalize the soul of a civilization. I think that's where his pessimism comes in. Really, it's the idea that, and what we're talking about with the incel thing and the depressed man, it's like you get the sense that there's something missing, something's wrong, something's broken, but what can I do? Really nothing. I mean, and that's why he had said, we're basically on the downturn, just hold the line as the fucking barbarians and the fucking flood comes in. I'm not saying that is what's going to happen, but it's just a bunch of interesting ideas. I had a couple more, but I really do actually have to get going. But what do you think of all that? What's your take? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, I like the idea of Caesarism. We spoke on it a little bit earlier, but I think it's important to make the distinction that this isn't really about Trump. Trump is a Caesar in that sense, but so is every other president in the last 50 years, right? Because all of them were, and this is something that's very sad that we've normalized, but this idea that you're voting for somebody who will be your strong man to try to bring life back to the thing that you miss. And that's not possible, but that's still what we do because we don't have any other option. And Trudeau, weed bro is the same shit. Like nobody voted for Trudeau because he reminded you of your brother and you feel this hard fought fraternity with him, that he is your leader and you will follow him into the breach. Nobody feels that. And the truth is and it's almost corny to talk about that now, but our ancestors felt that way, and that's how our civilizations were built. That's how we grew.
Yeah. And that's why that's why we all, even in our very, very loose dissident movement, like we're always trying to say, like, who can we elect to unite everyone? Like the problem is that we are still, in my opinion, building up that soul. We don't have that soul, that ethic, that morality, that thing that actually does unite us. And all we can ever do really is elect the next Caesar. And it's very easy for these people to be grifters and con artists. And that's why it keeps fucking happening, because they have all that shit. But fuck, I was going to say something, but I forget what it was. Yeah. Anyway, I do. It feels like it's on the downswing, and here's what it was. Like I said, the last stages of a civilization is just straight up imperialism, but there still is that Faustian spirit where the people we're against, our opponents, are actually fundamentally connected to us in that sort of spirit. And again, the inverted Evolian shadow version of that is the one world government. That is the idea. That's what they're trying to do. We're trying to connect the world. We're trying to go out and make a system. And he said, like, that is going to be the death of all civilizations. If we just have, and again, this was back in like, what was it, 1918. So he's predicting the NWO. He's saying, the end game of all of this is the global city, because he said the giant metropolis tends to signal the downturn of any civilization. That's
Yeah.
where you start bringing in, and again, this has happened across time. You have a big city, it destroys the countryside. People come in, they become fragmented and nomadic, and again, the only thing they have is the romanticism of the past. That is dead. That is worshiping a corpse. There is
Yeah,
no
yeah.
soul. So you just have this
So it's like
nomadic people. So imagine that.
some Bill Gates NWO 2040 shit is actually Atlantis. It's the signal of 1,000-year dark age.
Yeah, yeah. Basically, it's like, and he's like, okay, if you have that on a global scale, if you got just one big giant city, it's like you're done. There's nothing. And so it's like when people talk about conspiracy theories, they talk about, oh, NWO. It's like, first of all, this is what they're actively talking about with the Great Reset. This is what the UN is talking about. We're talking about having like a one world government, and they're celebrating it. So it's not even a conspiracy theory. The other thing is, it's like, this has happened before throughout time. The reason we're doing this is because we've noticed the patterns for various civilizations. It tends to precede the fall in across, not just in Rome, but in China, in India, in these great cities. It all seemed to happen. They lost something, and then so he's like, just imagine that on a global scale. It's like, I don't know. Like, I see us getting there day by day. I get calling me a conspiracy theorist. I see, the slow boiling of the frog in that sense.